Okay, well, we are just at 1 minute past noon, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Let's see, on a quick note, I'm going to put a link in the chat for any MSUM students who are logged on today. If you are attending for Pathways credit as an MSUM, oh, that's the wrong link, y'all. Sorry about that. I'll get the right one in there here in a minute. If you are an MSUM student attending for Pathways credit today, do be sure that you log on or RSVP on Dragon Central to our event today. Let's talk about TERFs. So for those who don't know me, my name is Dana Bisignani. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the coordinator of gender and sexuality here at MSUM, and I oversee the Rainbow Dragon Center, which is hosting today's event. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and taking their time to educate us all. I'm going to let them introduce themselves here in just a minute. So before we get started, I did want to just start with a land acknowledgement, right? So we, wherever we are logging on from, we are residing on stolen land. And MSUM in particular resides on the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwa, the Dakota, Insisitan Wahpeton, and Yanktonai Dakota First Nations. So we will strive to build a better relationship between our university and the Indigenous peoples who are still present with us. So we did just want to start out today with sort of a community agreement, as with all of our events that talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and particularly those that talk about identity. We know that sometimes they can be a little bit controversial and that folks can have strong opinions. So we hope that everyone is logged on today with an open mind to learn, and we welcome you all. But we do want to just remind everyone to please be respectful with your questions as well as in the chat. If we do have any folks who violate our community agreement today, we are just going to make you aware that we'll ask you to leave today's event. So the last announcement I wanted to pitch before we get started here is for those on MSUM's campus, April is also Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. So you can see that I'm holding in my hand a bingo card. So all month long, students on campus can pick up one of these bingo cards for Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month in the Office of Student Activities, which is in CMU room 113. And there are lots of great activities and social media things and resources that you can visit on this card to make bingo. All you have to do is fill out one row in any direction, including that free space that you get in the middle, and then you can bring your completed bingo card back to student activities and they will give you a fantastic prize. So the first 100 students who complete one of these this month will actually, the first 100 students to turn in their card will win a plush unicorn with an MSUM hoodie on it that says "Consent is Magical." They're super cute. They're over in the student activities office if you want to see them. And our event today, our panel, does count as one of these events. So if you're logged onto this panel today as a student, you've already completed one box and are on your way to bingo. So please make sure that you get a bingo card in the Office of Student Activities. We have just a few over here in the Women's Center in Bridges 154 as well. All right, so let's get down to our event today. So I've already introduced myself. Who would like to start? Faye, you're right below me on the Zoom screen here. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us your name, and a little bit about what you do in the community here?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Faye Seidler, and I do quite a few things, but I work as an LGBTQ plus care coordinator with Canopy Medical Clinic, which is a women's health clinic. I also serve on the advisory health board from North Dakota Department of Health for queer issues specifically. Beyond that, I do a lot of general cultural competency training and education, both in healthcare and education. And most of my work is about improving outcomes for queer youth. Tends to be the focus both for queer youth and for just individuals trying to pursue healthcare. That tends to be my focus and what I do. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Faye. Okay, how about I will kick it down then to Katrina. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, I'm Katrina Koesterman. I use she, her pronouns. I am president of Tristate Transgender, which is a local and regional support group for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals in the tri-state area. In my role as president of Tri-State Transgender, I also do some political activism, very, very part-time, working on House Bill 1298 and trying to make sure that doesn't pass is my most recent endeavor.
Great, thank you so much. Anthony, how about you? You introduce yourself to us.
Hi, yeah, I'm Anthony. I go by they, them, or he, him. I'm just part of the trans community here in Morehead. I'm also part of Tri-State Transgender. And yeah, I do what I can.
Okay. Jennifer, you are our last panelist. Do you want to introduce yourself to us today?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jennifer Kupferman. I am a professor at MSUM. I taught there in various capacities over the last couple of years in the Women's and Gender Studies program and in political science. Before coming to MSUM, I was a human rights lawyer by training, and I worked in the field of humanitarian assistance, working with populations that have been forcibly displaced for various reasons, and working in particular with LGBTQ refugees and refugees engaged in sex work. So I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for anyone joining who can see Emily on here, I'm not going to ask Emily to introduce themselves, but Emily is sort of running any tech troubleshooting in the background for us. So thanks, Emily, for doing that today. All right, well, thank you all for your time today. So I've got some questions that we came up with ahead of time, and I think we can just have a conversation. And for our audience, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to type those in the Q&A function. If you scroll or hover your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom screen there, you should see an icon that says Q&A. You're welcome to type questions in there at any point during our event today, and we will get to those at the end. All right, so for our first question today, right, we know that many people logged on may have only just recently heard TERF and maybe don't know exactly what it is. So for those who don't know, what exactly is a TERF and where did the ideology originate from? So I don't know who would like to start, but I will throw that question out there. Where did this come from?
If I may start, I have a lot of historical context for this to share.
Yeah, please.
And so trans-exclusionary radical feminist was a term, I believe, coined around the 1990s. It was coined by radical feminists, not trans women, but radical feminists who identified as cis likely, to distinguish themselves from the radical feminists who were trans-exclusionary. There's often a misnomer that happens that trans individuals created this label to in some way delegitimize the points TERFs are making, but it was not created by trans women. The ideology itself started to form with second wave feminism. And it's actually really interesting because it seemed to kind of be a response to a lot of the medical treatment that trans women were getting at the time. The medical treatment for trans women starting in the 1950s and 60s, 70s in America was led mostly by male endocrinologists that had very sexist views on what it meant to be a woman. So when trans women went in for treatment, the endocrinologists would say, well, we're not going to treat you unless you are wearing dresses and high heels and have purses and are just this hyper-feminized individual, because to them that's, okay, now I can see this person as a woman. So what a lot of individuals saw outside of the medical community was these trans women that were forced to put on this hyper-femininity. And from that thought, it was this really superficial kind of appropriation of what it meant to be a woman. So based on that, we see the book, I have it right here, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male by Janice Raymond, which was basically the TERF Bible, and the ideology that was formed from there really talks about how they think it's a very superficial identity that's attacking what it means to be a woman by basically appropriating these stereotypes. She wasn't aware, probably, however, that these were something that were forced onto trans women to get the appropriate medical treatment that they needed. So that's kind of a brief history of where that started from, originated, and kind of started to develop into our consciousness, or our consciousness and feminism throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. So while it has changed from that fundamental aspect, you can really root a lot of it from the misunderstandings and misinformations that were around in the 1980s.
Yeah, thanks so much for providing that context for us, Faye. Anthony, Katrina, Jennifer, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, or maybe if you can remember, when was the first time you ran into, right, TERF as a term or as an ideology?
Sure. So the term TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist, is being credited to being coined by Viv Smythe, a freelance writer who ran a Feminist 101 blog at the time. She coined the term to describe the anti-trans rhetoric that was growing among some radical feminists, and it has lately been used to describe anyone with trans-exclusionary views, whether they identify as radically feminist or not. There is some debate over whether TERF is actually a slur. I don't think it is, but those who hold the view prefer the term gender critical, similar to how white supremacists prefer the term white nationalist. In short, though, TERFs believe that transgender women are invading, or the word Janice Raymond uses is raping women's spaces by mutilating their bodies with hormones and or surgery so that they can appear less threatening to quote-unquote real women. They fear the idea of a predatory male that can pretend to be transgender so that he may invade women's spaces and sexually abuse them. Some of them believe that being transgender is a mental illness or a misguided view, and they also believe that transgender men are really just misguided women and reject the notion that they are transphobic towards trans masculine individuals.
If I can, I'd like to address the term radical in here, because I think it's just important to know exactly what all of these terms mean, and so we're not conflating them. And I saw one of the questions in the panel was about radical feminism. So radical feminism is a response to liberal feminism. Okay, so liberal feminism grew out of the Enlightenment. It's all about if we can change laws, we can make women equal with men, right? So it's this emphasis on women being able to vote, women legally being able to enter the workplace. That's liberal feminism. Radical feminism, which is normatively, I'll just say it's a good thing. And it's just pretty much all feminists and feminist conversations, I think, are radical, because radical feminism is about smashing the patriarchy, right? It's about making structural changes in how our society thinks about gender roles and men and women. Radical feminism recognizes that we're not going to change society to be the way we want it only by changing laws. So radical feminism, the trans-exclusionary radical feminism, is attaching the trans-exclusionary part onto what is now, I think, mainstream feminism. Just to clarify that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Jennifer. Anthony, did you want to weigh in on any of this?
I'm not as well educated, I'm sorry. But I remember seeing the term TERF on social media spaces pretty much, especially Tumblr, I think I first saw it in 2013, 2014, maybe earlier than that. But I got myself educated on that term and just understood that it's not a good ideology, personally. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I think that we want to acknowledge that we can talk about the ideology at sort of this higher level way, right? But I think remembering throughout our discussion today that these ideologies have real impacts on people, right, walking around in trans bodies, and so I just want to acknowledge that. Yeah, so that this ideology and the term, right, really sounding like it's rooted in these very harmful stereotypes, right, particularly about trans women, right, as not being real women, and I've always found it really interesting and also maddening, right, to hear this argument that that somehow men, right, cis men, are going to use the inclusion of trans women as an excuse to dress up as women, go into women's bathrooms, and then sexually assault them, right? So I always find it interesting that the real thing people are saying when they say that is that men are harmful to women. Men are dangerous to women. Not that trans women are dangerous to women, but that men are dangerous to women. And of course, we know that, right, men don't need an excuse to dress up as women. Also, we know not what trans women are, right? but that they don't need that excuse, right, to dress up as women, that women tend to be sexually assaulted in, right, spaces like their own home, right, in private spheres, and they tend to know the people who assault them. And so that's really just a myth, and I wanted to point that out. So TERFs then justify, I think you touched a little bit on this, you know, a couple of you did. TERFs justify the exclusion of trans women from women-only spaces by arguing that cis women, cisgender women, won't feel safe if we do that. So where have we heard this kind of argument before?
Well, I don't like to draw this comparison a whole lot because it oversimplifies the matter, but it's very similar to the Jim Crow era South and excluding Black Americans from white-only spaces. I'm sorry, someone just posted in the chat if the panelists would please provide a coherent definition of the word woman. Unfortunately, I don't think that's possible. There are as many different kinds of women as there are women, in my opinion. There's not any one definition of woman. If you feel that you are a woman, then I believe that you can call yourself a woman. You don't have to call yourself a woman. But if you feel that you are a woman, it is my opinion that you have the right to call yourself a woman.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going back to the idea, right? Simone de Beauvoir, right, in the 1940s saying, right, one is not born, but becomes a woman, right? One is socialized into being feminine, and yes, that we are who we feel we ourselves to be. Okay. All right, so I think just diving back into that question, right, if any of our other panelists would like to pick up on, right, where have we heard these arguments before, that if we include trans women in feminism or in women-only spaces, that's somehow going to create an element of danger?
I'd offer that we typically always hear them when you have the us versus them mentality. And that can be rooted in sexism, it can be rooted in racism, it can be rooted in xenophobia. And it's always that fear of other. And it's a fear of speculation that's put in there and overblown to this idea that harm can come if this out group is somehow included into this in group. And if you look at how a lot of prejudices play out, they always have very similar narratives to that. It's always very similar to how they talk about the fear of what's going to happen to them based on what's going to happen from other people. And then kind of similar with what Katrina was talking about earlier with Jim Crow laws, while I mean it's not necessarily comparable how minority stress impacts individuals, how dominant ideology can have negative impacts on individuals, plays out very similarly within groups that experience this, and that we've seen throughout history from all groups.
I mean, the history of feminism, the feminist movement, as we talk about it here in the West and in the United States, is a history in many ways of exclusion. I mean, first it was, it's for the so-called first wave was, voting rights for white middle-class women, and it was excluding Black women, excluding poor women. Then you have, in the so-called second wave, this divide between lesbian women and straight women, and you had Betty Friedan calling lesbians the Lavender Menace, and they were distracting from the feminist movement. So this, conversation about trans women and TERFs for me is part of this longer continuum of feminism, but learning from its mistakes and fits and starts, and yet it keeps coming back to this idea of, well, who are we going to exclude next? Because we want to get somehow to this perfect definition of woman. And I think that's part of what this conversation is about, right? About how trans women are like best positioned in some ways to argue what all feminism is and should be about, which is upending gender norms and ideas of biological essentialism, right? This idea of who is a woman. I think, I would agree with Katrina, anyone who wants to call themselves a woman is a woman. It doesn't mean that you feel feminine. It doesn't mean that you have certain sex characteristics. What we're trying to get at is doing away with biological essentialism and determinism. And I think that in the same way that originally the feminist movement was exclusive of other types, other women, now it's just exclusive. We're having the conversation about trans women. So it's part of a larger history.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just do want to issue a gentle reminder to our attendees today that if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A and not in the chat so we can ask those at the end. And let's keep our questions respectful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we know that part of why TERF has become part of our popular discourse now is that a lot of several celebrities, for example, J.K. Rowling, right, the author of the Harry Potter series, have used their platforms to spread these ideas. So what might you say to those who, for example, loved Harry Potter and now find themselves feeling hurt and betrayed by the author, or right, for other celebrities who create art and then use their platform to spread these ideas? What would you say to people who are feeling really hurt and betrayed by those celebrities who do have such large platforms? I don't know who'd like to start.
I would probably say, for me, when I first saw those tweets, I'm like, oh no. Harry Potter was such a big part of my childhood. I loved it growing up, and to hear that from a creator that I like their work, for me, there was some kind of level of separating the art from the artist, or like the creator from the creation. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's what I've primarily done. Like, I could still enjoy Harry Potter, but try to separate Rowling from the creation. That's what I've done.
Yeah, this is something that I have struggled with a bit, because I too enjoyed Harry Potter quite a bit in my youth. It actually helped to form my identity. However, I think that it is important to, as Anthony said, try to separate the author from the work, and remember that J.K. Rowling is not the only creator behind Harry Potter. A lot of people associate Harry Potter with the actors in the movies, many of whom have spoken out against Rowling's controversial views. So from that perspective, I think that I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
I think that it is okay to continue to enjoy Harry Potter, so long as you are educated and understand that J.K. Rowling is not a perfect person and has her own views that can sometimes be hateful. Yeah, no. When you mention the movies, it's like, yes, because they may have the original context material from the books, but they have different directors and definitely even actors that have come out against that support trans people. And yeah, definitely agreed.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's sometimes a hard thing for people to figure out, right? Do we just not read anything produced by that artist, right, or not listen to their music at all, or is it still okay, as you said, to sort of divorce the artist from the art? Yeah. So I think following up on that, right, we've been hearing a lot about cancel culture, especially within the context of Rowling's comments. What would you say to those who argue that we should all be free to express opinions on this subject without fear of backlash, right? That we're all entitled to our opinion. Anyone want to tackle that?
There's something I've been educating about lately with my work, and that is there's a belief that everyone's entitled to their opinion. And I think a better reframe to that is everyone is responsible for their opinion. And whatever you say, whatever you do, the actions you have do have consequences. And for anything that I talk about, I expect that. I expect that if I say something that is problematic, I will be called out for it. I will be challenged for it, and I will rise up to that challenge to either change if I am wrong, do further research if it's warranted, or listen to those concerns. And this idea of cancel culture, especially with Rawlings and 200, a letter signed by like over 200 people about how it's stifling free speech, is so interesting to me because of how often it's very classist. These individuals that were signing it were people that had a lot of social clout, a lot of wealth, and in the most deeply ironic way, J.K. Rawlings, I looked up her Twitter, has something like 14 million followers or something, and to say with such a large platform that she is being canceled or her free speech is being stifled in some capacity while she's continuing to talk to millions of people is this deep irony that I find awful. A lot of it just seems to stem from classism. It stems from individuals who hold positions of power who don't want to be criticized. And it's often marginalized communities who feel the brunt of criticism when they try to speak out about either discrimination, harassment, or violence. Even with things like sexual assault, you experience so much pushback from people in power when you just try to talk about those issues. But we're expected to allow individuals in positions of power to say whatever they want, regardless of the consequences their actions may have, because, well, everyone can just say whatever they want. And you absolutely can. That is part of free speech, is you can say what you want. However, you're not immune from the consequences of what you say or the impact those consequences are going to have.
I absolutely agree with Faye. Another very controversial figure in the trans community, Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints, has an excellent video about cancel culture, which I recommend people watch. I realize she's a very controversial figure because she has given a voice to people who have said some hateful things in the past. But I would recommend watching it. I think it's really tempting in our society to take someone's words out of context and use them as a bludgeon to silence their opinions that we don't like. And I think this should be resisted. Free speech is important in our society. That having been said, I think that it is important to realize that free speech has consequences. That if you say something that is hurtful or hateful, that there are going to be consequences from the people that you are marginalizing. That there's going to be consequences from people who support the people that you are marginalizing. So yeah.
I'd like to echo some of those sentiments, and really the way that I see this argument about cancel culture, which is by and large being talked about and complained about from elites with huge national platforms, are claiming that they're being canceled. To me, it seems like they're upset they're getting pushback. These are people in positions of power, especially I love it when these cis, white, hetero men who have their own TV shows decry cancel culture as if they can't say certain things anymore. You can say things. You're going to get pushback. You just can't have the last word anymore. And I think that, there's, I was reading some philosophical critiques of this idea of cancel culture before this panel in preparation. And I came across this article, I think it was on Jezebel. Robin James, this philosopher from UNC, plucked out this Michel Foucault quote to talk about cancel culture. So if you don't know who Foucault is, he's a very famous post-structuralist philosopher, French. Post-structuralism is all about the importance of words and language and the effects of discourse and how we say things. And this quote from Michel Foucault is so perfect. So contemporary cancel culture, in the words of Foucault, I think you would agree, speaks verbosely of its own silence, takes great pains to relate in detail the things it does not say, denounces the powers it exercises, and promises to liberate itself from the very laws that have made it function. This is another form of moral panic. And you have these institutions and these people in these centers of power who are claiming to identify crises and threats, and this threat of trans inclusion and these threats of trans people that only they can purport to solve. So it's another way of using language as a way of maintaining their own power and insisting that only they can see these threats and only they can keep us safe. When in reality, I think these are people who are used to moving through the world, being able to say what they want and not being held accountable. I mean, it's like saying that, civil disobedience during the civil rights movement and the sit-ins at Woolworths were all a form of cancel culture. They weren't canceling anything, but they were engaging in civil disobedience and showing there's consequences and an ability, you can say whatever you want. We still have free speech. Your First Amendment rights are not being violated, but you can't expect to say whatever you want and not get any pushback. And I think people who are used to that are getting upset that that's no longer the case.
Yeah. I think we can have a whole panel just on that topic.
No,
Culture and free speech. We'll save that for another event, maybe in the fall.
Sure. But it's interesting to think about the actual power of the people who are decrying cancel culture.
Yeah.
The power is being taken away. The privilege is being limited a little bit. I think.
Right. Yeah. Indeed. Okay. So I don't know, before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to check in with you, Anthony, to see if you had anything you wanted to say in response to that question.
No, I think you guys got the bases covered.
Okay. All right. So I think, talking about these shifts in power, right, and pushing back against, laws and systems that really haven't been working for a long time. But also, I want to go back to Alok's keynote, right, for Trans Day Visibility that we also had. Alok saying that, a lot of these laws are trying to, right, erase trans people or are using law to erase them, right, when they've always been here. And so this recent wave of anti-trans bills is currently making its way through at least 28 states right across the country, including both North Dakota and Minnesota. I know some of you have been working very hard against those. So all these target trans athletes in particular, this recent wave. So those supporting the bills, sometimes argue that including trans women in women's sports somehow disadvantages women and girls, because trans girls would have an advantage because of their quote unquote male biology, right? That's the argument. So what's the misunderstanding about biology that's at work here in these arguments?
I can field that if you're all okay with that, since I do a lot of work in medicine in general. One of the things that is sometimes unfortunate is a lot of TERF discussions tend to be from individuals who are usually in some way feminist. And a lot of times the rhetoric, they don't consider themselves to be hateful. They don't. They often are rising concerns about these things. They think that these concerns are very valid based on experiences either they've had or been informed by. But a lot of times they also exist in these filter bubbles where they just talk to each other. They highlight every negative experience about trans individuals, and it just kind of continues a cycle on in itself. But when looking at the medicine of it, when you're actually looking at biology, medical treatment, and outcomes and things like that, there's a lot of clear signs that occur. And biological essentialism is, we talked about that very briefly, but that's this kind of idea that men and women are this very distinct thing based on biology, and then our culture is inherent based on these biological aspects, and that's biological essentialism. We know that it's not. Regardless of your body, and I'm not saying trans or cis, regardless of your body, how you identify, how you interact with culture, how you challenge it or conform to it, that is all up to you. That is how you as an individual get to identify within any given culture or society. When we're talking about medicine, we're talking about biology, a lot of what we see is this understanding that there's this very rigid binary and there's only either men or women. And then you talk about intersex folks, individuals who don't neatly fit into these categories, and usually you're asked to disregard that. Well, that's just a medical anomaly. We can't worry about that. But in actuality, it's normal human diversity, normal human biodiversity. We have several sex systems, and a lot of what we consider sex is based on hormones. It's based on hormonal development. And this idea that trans women are biological men and cis women are biological men, and they exist within this Venn diagram, is not an accurate or useful way to look at it. Regardless of how you feel, it's not useful, because a trans woman could go on hormone therapy. They could never go through male puberty. They could have very normal, typical cis development. And a more somewhat interesting thing was with myoplastia. I forget the exact word offhand, but what they find is when there's actually surgery done, bottom surgery in trans women, it actually becomes just vaginal cells. Like, biology is very interesting. If you have a bone marrow transplant, your DNA changes to the DNA of the marrow you got transplanted. So this idea that there is this really constrictive, you're only male, you're only female, doesn't really work in biology. I mean, it's useful as a category. A lot of cis women, a lot of individuals who are assigned female at birth will have very standard in terms of risk, in terms of development, in terms of anything like that. Same with cis men. But if you transition, that doesn't hold true anymore. So like a trans woman who were to transition hormone blockers, then to go through a normal transition for them into a young lady, they are not going to have any advantage whatsoever for any cis female. And to make any exclusionary or to make any discriminatory thing saying all trans women are this John Cena type, huge muscle bound, like juggernauts, and all women are these weak creatures that need to be protected from this hypothetical, insanely powerful trans female athlete is really absurd when you look at the data and the research behind it. I can guarantee you, most high school girls could defeat me in sports in any category. I am just not that great. So even being a trans woman myself, I am not confirmed with all of this huge advantage that we hear about. And there is a lot more research behind this. I've done hundreds of hours in it because I always look at what is the actual research saying. So that's a little bit of a look in history behind all of that.
Yeah, it sort of erases this idea that there have ever been men who are not athletic, like cis men who are not athletic, and they certainly exist, right? As do cis women who like weight lift incredible amounts, right? So yeah, it just erases the existence of those people as well. I don't know if anyone else would like to also add on to that.
Yeah, and I think that I want to agree with everything that Faye said, because she's done a whole lot more research on this than I have, because she's awesome. But I also just want to say that another thing that gets missed in the forwarding of bills like HB 1298 is that if it were to pass, it would also force trans men who are more masculinized, who may be from puberty blocking drugs and taking testosterone, be stronger, be more masculine, would have to then compete against cisgender women, which just perpetuates the unfairness that the bill is trying to prevent. Now, obviously, it's not fair to say that transgender men are going to automatically be stronger than cisgender women, because that's just that's just perpetuating erasure, just like you said, Dana. But also the bills completely negate the idea of non-binary individuals and where they fit in the sports continuum.
If I could alight for a second on the part of your question that asks, why do people fall back on biology? What is it that people are holding on to? And I think the answer is fear. I mean, I think for a lot of people, accepting that gender is a social construct is much easier than accepting that sex is also a social construct, right? Because when we talk about gender, we talk about ideas of masculinity and femininity, and we can talk about how, well, what's feminine has changed over time if you look at styles of clothing, or, you can start out in ways that are very concrete. But with biology, and I think a lot of what TERFs are holding on to comes back to this question of fear. But if we look at, sex is a social construct, like what Katrina was saying. If a woman has a double mastectomy, is she still a woman? What makes someone a woman? If a woman has a hysterectomy, is she still a woman? Is it chromosomes that make someone a man or a woman? Because we can look at, millions of people whose chromosomes don't exactly fit. So it becomes a moving target. But I think that a lot of it is just generated through fear. Like, this is what we've internalized. It's what we know. And this idea that if we can't even fall back on biology, then what does that mean? I think it's this fear of the unknown that is part of what is driving that falling back on biology.
And if I can add one thing to this as well, is that I do think these discussions are legitimate to have. There's sometimes this idea that you'll have these trans rights activists that will just force equality regardless of all the consequences of it. And when you see that in discussions, you see that in groups like I talk with filter bubbles. But I work with administrators. I work with the individual at the YWCA, which is a women's shelter. During the sports testimony, we heard from leaders in women's sports. So we're looking at the people who are experts in these fields, looking at, do trans women pose a harm? And this research says no. Do trans women pose a harm to cis women in sports? And the research, again, just says no. And when you look at the individuals who actually are operating in these fields, who are looking at all of the data and looking at the inclusivity of it and measuring, is there a consequence for this? Is there not? Is inclusion going to be helpful? They're coming to the conclusion that inclusion is going to not be harmful for anyone. So this is something that we do look at these questions. They're not ignored. We look at the research, look at the data, we look at the outcomes, and we make best policy decisions based on those, not necessarily feelings. It would be great if we could say, hey, accept everyone, and that's the end of the conversation. But a lot of this discourse is marred in misinformation. And it's marred in a deep-seated amount of fear, misinformation, bias, and prejudice. So it's sometimes hard to have those conversations about it. But I do want to address that we do look at these. We look at the data, we look at the outcome, we look at what actually happens in terms of sports and everything else.
Oops, looks like we lost Jennifer. Hopefully she'll be able to log back on with us. Yeah, and I think, following up on that, like I often hear some arguments sometimes around Title IX as well, and what Title IX was able to do for women in education. And oftentimes sports is the arena that is talked about most, right? Title IX really opened up a lot of opportunities for women to participate in sports, which is true. But also that, Title IX, the purpose of Title IX was never to sort of reinforce this gender binary, right? The purpose of Title IX, specifically looking in the arena of sports, was to make sure that there were, equal opportunities, right, based on gender for people to participate in sports at educational institutions, right? And it never really necessarily had anything to do with reinforcing that gender binary. But, yeah, I did see, happen to see a comment in the chat about, I sort of, creating arenas or spaces, safe spaces around bodies rather than identities. But I do want to point out that we really cannot divorce those things, right? I mean, our identities are very much rooted in the bodies we move through the world in. I think I'll give a shout out to Sonia Renee Taylor, who's a queer Black feminist writer, does a really amazing job with the blog The Body Is Not an Apology, and with her book by the same name, talking about some of that as well. Right? Our identities are very much tied to an embodied experience in the world. Yeah. Should we move on to our next question, and hopefully Jennifer can hop back on, or did anyone have more they wanted to say before we moved on?
I just want to say really quickly that I have been glancing at the chat and glancing at the comments, and I am really excited to help answer some of these questions at the end. So thank you very much for your questions and your comments. I realize that we don't agree and that we are not going to agree probably by the end of the day, but I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think that civil discourse is indeed possible between us. So thank you for your questions.
Okay. All right. So I hope everyone appreciates how generous that is. Okay, so I am just sort of keeping an eye on our time as well, because I do want us to have time for Q&A. So Jennifer, glad you were able to hop back on with us. I feel like that always happens in the age of Zoom, right? So I think, I'm looking at our questions that we have left. Why is it so essential, thinking about everything we've talked about so far, why is it so essential that feminist movement includes and centers trans women and trans and gender non-conforming people in general as we move forward? Why is that so important?
Safety. I think that safety is paramount. We need to include trans and gender non-conforming individuals into feminism for the same reason that I think feminism exists in the first place to humanize and equalize individuals so they aren't easily discarded or have rights stripped away or aren't easily objectified and discarded as disposable individuals. I think it's a matter of safety.
I'd like to echo that. I mean, I think that there are two main things going on in what Katrina was talking about. One is safety, and I think that I would borrow from Ibrahim's Kendi about being an anti-racist and how there's no such thing as being not racist. You're either racist or you're anti-racist, and I think that if transphobia and complacency towards it is harmful and it results in violence, and if we're not trans inclusive in an affirmative way, if we're not promoting trans safety and trans inclusion, then you are being complacent or silent or even complicit in allowing some of this violence to continue. So I would start thinking about it in those terms, because trans exclusion, even if the intent is not to cause harm, it does cause harm, and it reinforces biological essentialism, which not only causes violence for trans people, but is also undermining what feminism is actually all about, which is upending these larger the gender roles and gendered norms. And I think about this quote from the Combahee River Collective in 1977, this group of Black, radical lesbian feminists who wrote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression." And I'm not the first person to think about this idea, but if trans women are safe and free, and if trans women of color are safe and free, then I think the world is going to be a much better place for all women. So I would say that those goals are very much aligned, and this idea that the political and social goals of the feminist struggle are the same. It's the same with trans rights, right? It's getting away from this idea that because of how because of your biology, it should somehow dictate your social role or your safety in this world.
If I can add a little bit to that, I think one of the things that we lose in the transphobia, whether you consider your statements that or not, is that this violence that we instill by insisting that trans women are actually men and dangerous, who gets to identify as women? Like, let's not worry about their identity, but it's where how they are treated by other individuals, because not all cis women, so not trans women, are identified just on site as female. And what we see is a lot of violence happening to cis women is because they don't have bodies that conform to these ideals we put on women. So there are stories of cis women being harassed in bathrooms, forcibly ejected. There's one where this woman had her arm broken by a bouncer because she was using the ladies' restroom. So when we put all of this vitriol on these trans women and saying, oh, they're men, we have this unconscious bias that we assume that we can tell if someone's trans or not, and we can't. And not all cis women have that privilege. Not all cis women have what you call passing privilege. And there are a lot of women that I've spoken to, cis women, who have talked about this throughout their life, especially more women who present more in a butch manner, or more butch lesbians have talked about being harassed or excluded from women's spaces because of how their body looks. And if we understand this transphobia is limiting all women and creating situations where all women can experience harm, we can understand the unity that we need to have in addressing these issues in ways that can promote equality for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, arguing over the essence of a woman is the exact opposite, I think, of the broader goal of feminism.
Yeah, just seeing the comment in the chat too that many men are vulnerable in men-only spaces, right? Including gay men, sort of effeminate or pretty men, young men, disabled men. That's absolutely true, right? That is true, but I think the same is also true, right, for women-only spaces, right? We know that people of any gender or sexual orientation can commit violence against people of the same gender, same sex, and that's not true only for men, it's true for women as well. So yeah, I think this sort of old idea that one gender only spaces are safe, are automatically safe is just not true, right? That's the reality of that is not true. Yeah. Anthony, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not a whole lot.
Okay.
You guys pretty much covered the bases, to be honest.
Okay. All right, well, we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to prioritize having some questions from participants. We had a couple of questions left, but I think we can save at least one of those for the end to kind of wrap us up. So, Katrina, I know you've been looking at the Q&A a little bit. I don't know if there is a particular question that you're really eager to answer. Otherwise, I can pick something and we can start the conversation from there. And if folks do have questions they want to add to the Q&A, again, please do put them in the Q&A versus in the chat so we can keep track of them. We have a lot to choose from here. I think Katrina, maybe while you're looking, oh, sorry, I just saw you unmuted yourself. Did you have one?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I do see someone who's asking, what is intersex and how is that an issue?
Sure. So I'm not a biologist. I don't have a whole lot of education on the matter. However, an intersex individual is someone who is born with physical or chromosomal characteristics of both male and female bodies. So someone who is born with an XXY chromosome, or someone who is born with male chromosomes but has vaginal genitalia, or vice versa. Someone for whom traditional binary descriptors of male and female simply do not apply. And it's an issue because not all of these individuals want to fit into the binary, and they shouldn't have to fit into the binary. And so trying to force a binary society onto them is extremely obstructive and unfair. I hope that answers the question.
I don't know if anyone else wanted to add anything. Otherwise, I'll pick another question for us.
I can just add a little bit to that. I think when you have a very, you need to really look up biological essentialism, because the unconscious bias that forms from that and from trying to force male and female as the only things that can exist top down, you're going to keep on coming to the same conclusions that aren't correct. And unless you challenge that bias, then nothing we say is going to matter, because you're going to have that fundamental worldview that's not going to be changed or challenged. There are useful categories, like we said. With intersex, it's part of natural biodiversity. Like we were talking about, sex is a construct. It's something that we label. And you could say that a penis equals male, that is fine. But how does that actually work within society? How does that work within how we culture things? How does that work within how our bodies are treated, especially with gender diverse bodies? That could be something that has had different hormone development or different second sexual characteristics. These are big questions that you have to examine, thoroughly look through. You can't just make this assumption that I would encourage people to look at biology, to actually do some research and study on it and read some articles about it. Sex is a spectrum, and that's the easiest thing you can say about it. Yeah, there are binary poles we can talk about with male and female, but we exist within those oftentimes.
Yeah, I was so very struck, in Alok's talk last week, where they were talking about the history of where the gender binary really came from. Of course, we know that's tied to colonization on this continent, right, and to U.S. imperialism. And they were talking about within the eugenics movement in the U.S. in the early 1900s, that part of that idea that white people were somehow better than people of color and indigenous cultures was that we had, quote unquote, evolved into this strict and clear gender binary. and that's part of what underpins white supremacy. So really just, tying together these systems of oppression, right, which, intersectionality is so foundational to feminism and to all our collective liberation. But that idea that this idea of a strict gender binary was very much tied to white supremacy and to the roots of the eugenics movement in the US. And I found that so very important to acknowledge and think about. So I have a question here from a student, actually. It says, do you think abolishing women's and men's categories could be beneficial rather than categorizing them in a different way outside of specifically sex or gender? If strength differences are an issue, categorizing by that perhaps? Like, are there other ways to categorize people or organize our world, or should we just abolish men's and women's categories altogether?
I think maybe having like a certain weight class might help if you wanted to separate. Because, I mean, let's say to use the, to say like wrestling has weight classes, it doesn't matter to them. I mean, if you're in a certain weight class, like, you can compete. So if you did want to get rid of men's sports, women's sports, just go by weight class or height class or whatever, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know if abolishing the men and women's characteristic is entirely the way to go. I think that maybe oversimplifying matters, but shifting to more to allowing men and women to participate in traditionally men and women's sports and being able to be sorted by weight class or height difference or physical or other physical characteristics, I think may be the way to go. For example, allowing cisgender men and trans men to participate in synchronized swimming, which is traditionally a female sport, and being able to be sorted into different categories based on other physical characteristics, or allowing cisgender females and trans women to participate in football, which is a traditionally male sport, based on weight class and other physical characteristics. I think that may be something to explore. I don't think that it's the end-all be-all, but it's something to explore and something to experiment with.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had cisgender girls certainly sort of, making their way into these very traditionally male sports like football, right, Katrina, that you just pointed out. And I think a lot of feminists often applaud that as a win, right? But it seems to be like when it's the other way around, when we're thinking about, trans girls or trans boys playing on the team sport that matches their gender identity, that aligns with that, then somehow we are troubled by it. And I think that maybe that goes back to that, that underlying fear, Jennifer, that you talked about earlier. Yeah. Okay. So I know we just have about a minute left. I'm going to ask maybe for those logged on today, what are some ways that feminists and other allies can help push back against some of these harmful ideologies that we talked about today and the transphobic arguments that we've discussed? What are some ways that feminists and other allies can help support the trans community?
I mean, I'll just go ahead and start. I would educate yourself more if you're interested. If you're interested in questions like what does intersex mean, go to organization Intersex International. Look at resources. Look at what the evidence is actually saying. But on a broader level, I would say that if you have some sort of privilege, use it. Use your privilege to push inclusion forward. Call out transphobia where and when you see it. Call out the falsehoods and the myths when you see them. Try to call people in instead of calling people out. And the onus isn't on trans people to fight against these bills. It's not against trans people to fight against transphobia. It's on all of us to start thinking about these issues on a broader level and to understanding why this is important for feminism in general. I think isolating these conversations and saying, well, that's about trans rights, is only going to, it's not helping feminism, but it's also, what you can do as an ally is making sure that you are ensuring spaces are inclusive and that your language is inclusive. And, I'll cede the floor to Faye now and, anyone else who wants to answer this question. But I think that, if you are privileged, if you are cisgender, there's a lot that you can do to push this conversation forward and be inclusive.
I'll follow up with just that call out for that. I've seen a lot of discourse with, and I'll be friendly here, gender critical feminists. And it really goes the same way every time. Like I have not seen a new point really made in the last 5 years from this discourse, and I try to continue to provide education. But there's just that disconnected communication when individuals are so, trying to be nice here, not indoctrined, but when you hear the same information over and over again, I really encourage to challenge that in yourself. And if you look up biologists, look what they are actually saying about these things. Look up feminists who have been inclusive of trans individuals. Look up Judith Butler's wonderful everything she's written about these issues. And if you don't change your mind, that's fine. That's great. But at least try to put in some of that effort, because while we often have these intellectual conversations about this, especially at a women gender study level, trans individuals are dying by violence, from both men and women, from cis individuals in general. Rejecting these youth this is from a medical aspect with, I can't express how many dozens of years of research. What we're seeing in the UK is not reflective of that. And if you actually delve deep into it, you will find that as well. Trans youth, if they're not affirmed and accepted, if they're not able to get medical treatment, the suicidality raises by double. If they're not accepted, if they're not affirmed, suicidality rises. The only thing that we've seen since 100 years ago, when we started seeing treatment for trans individuals globally, or 70 years in America itself, decades of this research, is it points in one direction. Affirming them and giving them medical care allows them to be to have mental health comorbidities with the same level of the general population. And the idea of it being a mental health issue gets purported. It's not. If you actually talk to experts who treat this, it is not. And I so wish that people would do this research, because like I say, when I am challenged and see new information presented, I look to see what that research actually says. If I see detransition rates are 60 to 90% for these youths, so we shouldn't allow this, I looked for about 10 hours into a dozen different studies looking at what this meant. And what we actually find is that if during puberty these youth experience more discomfort, anxiety, depression, then it is very unlikely they're going to detransition after treatment. Oftentimes people don't know what the treatment actually is. But there's real consequences